Welcome, my friend, to the warmth of Baker Street Ember. Settle in by the fire.
As we prepare for tonight's tale, I must ask, from which shadowy corner of the world are you listening? If you find comfort here, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Now.
The fog that November evening lay thick upon London, muffling the great city in its grey embrace. At 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, contemplating the criminal underworld, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin as blue smoke curled from his pipe. Then came the knock, urgent, desperate, 3 sharp raps that cut through the crackle of the coal fire. Chapter 1. The urgent summons. The fog that November evening lay thick upon London, muffling the great city in its grey embrace. At 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, contemplating the criminal underworld, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, while thin blue smoke rose from the bowl of his pipe. Dr. John Watson, seated opposite with a medical journal half read on his lap, glanced up at the sound of hurried footsteps ascending the stair. Mrs. Hudson opened the door with a worried expression. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Most urgent," he says. "Lord Charles Harrington." The visitor entered swiftly, removing his silk hat to reveal hair already silvered at the temples. His overcoat dripped fog moisture onto the rug. The sharp scent of damp wool mingled with the warm leather of the room and the acrid bite of coal smoke from the grate. He was tall, lean, and pale, eyes shadowed with something deeper than fatigue. "Emma!" "Holmes," he began, voice low and controlled. "I come in the strictest confidence. My family's honor hangs upon your discretion. My brother, Lord Archibald Harrington, was found dead this afternoon in the library of the Reform Club, alone, the door bolted from within. Scotland Yard has declared it suicide, cyanide in his brandy, a note of despair beside him. But I know my brother. He would never take his own life." "Describe the scene precisely, Lord Charles. Every detail, no matter how trivial." The nobleman complied, pacing slowly as he spoke. The library had been locked since luncheon. Archibald had retired there to read correspondence, requesting no interruptions. A waiter discovered him at 4 o'clock, slumped over the mahogany table, face purpled, foam dried at the corners of his mouth. The air had reeked of bitter almonds. A half-empty glass of brandy stood beside an ashtray containing the stub of a Havana cigar. The suicide note, in Archibald's unmistakable hand, spoke of crushing debts and political disgrace. Watson interjected gently. "The note was in his own writing?" "Undoubtedly," Lord Charles replied. "Yet something is wrong. He was not a man given to despair. He had enemies, political rivals, creditors, but he faced them with iron resolve." Holmes had already moved to the hearth, where he dropped to one knee and produced his magnifying lens. He scrutinized a small envelope Lord Charles had brought, containing a pinch of ash scraped from the tray. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, voice tight with concentration. "This is Havana leaf, coarse, rich, oily. Your brother preferred Turkish cigarettes, did he not, Lord Charles?" The nobleman blinked. "Yes." "How did you?" "Observation." Holmes sniffed the ash. "And here traces of another scent beneath the almonds." "Gunpowder?" "No, sulfur from safety matches." "Yet your brother used a silver lighter engraved with his crest." Lord Charles sank into the nearest chair, the rough wool of his trousers brushing the smooth pipe bowl Holmes absently offered him. "There are whispers at the club. Sir Evelyn Montague owed him enormous sums from cards. Colonel Fitzroy quarrelled violently with him last week over policy in India. Young Reginald Vale, the club secretary, was fiercely jealous of my brother's influence. Any of them might have wished him harm." Holmes paced rapidly now, boots soft on the worn Persian carpet. 4 suspects already. Motives clear. Debt, politics, ambition. Yet the locked room complicates everything. How does one administer poison without entering? Watson felt the cold metal of his watch chain against his wrist as he leaned forward. The brandy, perhaps, laced before he locked the door. Holmes shook his head. The glass bore 2 sets of fingerprints, your brother's, and a second, fresher set overlaid in the condensation. Someone handled it after the drink was poured. The fire crackled. Coal settled with a sharp pop. Outside, hansom cab wheels clattered on wet cobbles, rain tapping insistently at the window. The room grew chill as fog seeped beneath the sash, carrying the distant moan of Thames foghorns. Lord Charles rose. Emma, Holmes, Scotland Yard is content with suicide. They will not pursue this further. My brother's reputation, and our families, will be destroyed by the stain of self-murder. Holmes turned, eyes gleaming in the firelight. Then we shall pursue it. Tomorrow at first light, Watson and I will examine the library. Every inch, every trace. If murder has been done, it has left its signature. Watson nodded, admiration stirring despite the weight of the hour. Of course, Holmes. But a locked room. How can poison cross a bolted door? Holmes smiled thinly, the expression more wolf than man. That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we shall determine. The impossible is merely the unexplained. Lord Charles extended his hand. I am in your debt, sir. Whatever the cost. Costs are irrelevant, Holmes replied. Truth is not. The nobleman departed into the fog, his footsteps fading down the stair. Holmes returned to his chair, pipe relit, smoke culling upward like a signal. Watson poured brandy, the sweet liquid warming his throat against the night chill. You think murder, then? I know it. Holmes knelt again, lens in hand, examining the carpet where Lord Charles had stood. See here, a trace of reddish clay mixed with coal dust. Not from Pall Mall. From the East End docks, perhaps. Our visitor trod questionable streets before arriving. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Big Ben chimed 11, the deep tones vibrating through the walls. Holmes rose, eyes alight with that peculiar fire Watson knew so well. The locked room is no barrier to the clever murderer, he said quietly. It is his boast, and boasts, like fingerprints, betray their author. Watson felt the coarse wool of his own sleeve as he shivered. The case had begun. Already the threads of deception wove tight around the august walls of the Reform Club. Outside, rain strengthened, drumming on the roof. Somewhere in the fog-bound city, a killer walked free, confident, perhaps, that his secret remained safe behind a bolted door. Holmes turned to the window, staring into the swirling grey. The game, he murmured, is afoot. Chapter 2. The locked library. The November morning broke cold and grey, the fog so dense it turned Pall Mall into a tunnel of blurred gas lamps and muffled footsteps. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson stepped from their hansom cab, the horses' hoofs clopping wetly on the cobbles before the driver cracked his whip and vanished into the murk. The sharp smell of horse manure mixed with the damp wool of their overcoats, and the ever-present coal smoke drifting down from chimneys. The porter at the Reform Club recognized Holmes at once and hesitated, gloved hand on the heavy brass door. M.R. Holmes, sir. The committee has given strict instructions. No outsiders beyond the vestibule. Holmes inclined his head, voice low and precise. And yet a member lies dead in your library, poisoned in a room he himself locked. If the committee prefers scandal to solution, I shall withdraw at once. The porter flushed beneath his starch and admitted them. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the scent of old leather bindings, cigar smoke, and the faint bitter almond trace that still clung to the tragedy. Inspector Gregson waited near the staircase, arms folded, his bowler hat pushed back. Holmes, Gregson greeted, tone flat. We've sealed the room. Suicide, as I told you yesterday. The note is in his lordship's hand. The cyanide unmistakable. Scotland Yard needs no amateur theatricals. Watson felt the chill of the marble floor rise through his boots. Inspector, with respect, A medical man might wish to see the body before conclusions are drawn. Gregson shrugged. Body's gone to the mortuary. You'll have your report soon enough. Holmes ignored the barb and strode forward, boots clicking on the polished tiles. Then show us the library as it was found. The room had been left largely untouched. Heavy velvet curtains still drawn, gas brackets turned low, the fire in the grate reduced to glowing ash. The scent of bitter almonds hung stubborn beneath the carbolic the police had used to scrub the table. Lord Harrington had slumped forward in the high-backed chair, arms spread as though reaching for the brandy glass now removed. A single Havana cigar stub lay crushed in the tray. His lordship had never favored strong leaf. Holmes dropped to one knee, lens in hand. Observe, Watson. The chair has been shifted 6 inches from its usual place. See the fresh indentations in the carpet pile. Someone moved it after death, perhaps to stage the scene more convincingly. Gregson snorted. Or the man himself pushed back in his final agony. Possible, Holmes conceded, but unlikely. The angle of the body suggests he was struck suddenly. Look at the angle of the head. No convulsive thrashing one expects from cyanide. He fell forward almost at once. Watson bent closer, the cold metal of his spectacles brushing his cheek. You think the poison was not in the brandy? I think the brandy was a distraction. Holmes sniffed the empty glass tray. No residue of cyanide here, only the ghost of the almonds. Yet the victim's lips and tongue bore the classic staining. The delivery was internal, rapid, and precise. He moved to the bookshelf nearest the table, and here, 3 volumes pulled slightly forward. Someone reached behind them. His long fingers probed the gap. A small brass keyhole cover, recently oiled. The door was locked, yes, but from the corridor side a fine instrument could have been inserted through this aperture. Gregson laughed outright. A needle through the keyhole? Come now, Holmes. Holmes straightened, eyes bright. Not a needle. A syringe, thin enough to pass, long enough to reach the neck from the outside. The puncture mark is minute, on the left side, just below the ear, hidden by the collar. Watson, you will confirm it at the mortuary. Watson nodded slowly, admiration flickering behind his confusion. Then the murderer never entered the room. Precisely. He had no need. The locked door was his protection, not his obstacle. They questioned the club waiter next, a thin cockney named Tompkins, who stood twisting his apron in the servants' passage. The smell of damp cloth and carbolic soap clung to him. His lordship come in at 2:30, sir, Tompkins said. Asked for brandy, best French, he said, and told me not to disturb him. Door locked behind me when I left. Holmes leaned forward. Did you see anyone in the corridor after you departed? Tompkins hesitated. Only Mr. Vale, the secretary. He passed quick like going toward the smoking room. Looked white as chalk. He did. And Sir Evelyn Montague? Holmes asked. He were in the billiard room earlier playing with Colonel Fitzroy. Left about 3. I reckon, said he at business. Watson interjected. Any of them returned to this corridor? Not as I saw, sir. But the fog was thick outside. Could have slipped round the back way through the mews. Holmes thanked the man and turned away, pacing the length of the passage. The sound of coal settling in a distant grate reached them, soft and steady. Outside, foghorns moaned on the Thames, low and mournful. Later, in the smoking room, Sir Evelyn Montague sat alone, a fresh Havana between his fingers. The rich tobacco smoke curled upward, blending with the warm scent of brandy from his glass. Emma. Holmes, he said without rising, voice smooth and controlled. I understand you are meddling in poor Harrington's sad end. A pity. He was a fool with money, and an even greater fool with politics. Holmes regarded him coolly. And you owed him a considerable sum, I believe. Montague exhaled a perfect ring. Debts among gentlemen are settled privately. His death changes nothing. Colonel Fitzroy joined them moments later, red-faced and loud. Damned nonsense, this locked room talk. Man took his own life, couldn't face the ruin. I told him so last week. Holmes noted the colonel's walking stick, ebony, silver-mounted, tip worn from use. A fine stick, Colonel. You carry it even indoors. Habit from India, Fitzroy barked. Keeps the back straight. Holmes said nothing more, but his eyes lingered on the stick's length. Back in the cab returning to Baker Street, rain began to fall, tapping against the roof like impatient fingers. Watson tasted the metallic chill of the fog on his lips. You suspect the walking stick? He asked. Holmes smiled thinly, pipe glowing in the gloom. I suspect everyone, Watson, but the stick and the keyhole are promising. The murderer did not need to enter. He only needed to reach. The cab rattled on through the fog, wheels hissing on wet stone. Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. The game grows clearer, he murmured, and the hand that struck will soon be revealed. Chapter 3. The puncture in the shadow. The fog had thickened by afternoon, turning the narrow service corridor behind the Reform Club into a tunnel of grey wool. Sherlock Holmes moved ahead with the silent purpose of a cat, his lens catching faint gleams from the gas bracket overhead. Dr. Watson followed, the damp chill of the stone wool seeping through his coat, the rough texture of the brick grazing his knuckles as he steadied himself. They had returned after luncheon, armed with permission wrung from the club committee only after Holmes pointed out, calmly, inexorably, that continued obstruction would invite the scandal they most feared. Inspector Gregson trailed behind, grumbling, his boots scraping the flags with every step. Holmes paused at the library's outer door. Here, he said, voice low. The keyhole cover is brass, recently polished. But see, the tiny scratch beside it, fresh, no more than a millimeter long, metal on metal. A fine instrument was inserted here. Watson bent closer. The faint metallic scent of oiled steel lingered, undercut by the ever-present Thames mud that had been tracked in on someone's boots. You truly believe a syringe could reach through? Holmes produced a thin steel probe from his pocket, exactly the diameter of a hypodermic needle, and slid it gently through the keyhole. It passed with a soft metallic click, emerging inside the room by perhaps 4 inches, sufficient to strike the neck of a seated man. The chair had been positioned deliberately, 6 inches forward, as I noted earlier. The murderer knew where his lordship would sit. Gregson crossed his arms. Even if possible, who could manage such precision in fog and darkness? And why leave the door locked at all? To create the illusion of suicide, Holmes replied. A locked room is the perfect stage for despair. No struggle, no witnesses, only a note, a glass, and a corpse. They entered the library once more. The fire had been relit. Coal settled with small sharp pops, sending warm air culling upward. Yet the room still carried the ghost of bitter almonds, now mingled with the sharp carbolic the servants had used and the faint, rich residue of Havana tobacco. Holmes knelt beside the table, lens sweeping the carpet. Here, 2 small drops of blood, dried to brown specks, not from a wound on the hands or face, from the neck itself. He pointed to a barely visible puncture mark on the high wing of the chair, where the velvet had been nicked. The needle struck slightly off target first, grazed the collar, drew blood, then found the vein on the second attempt. Watson examined the spot, fingers brushing the smooth, cold velvet. A single drop would be enough to confirm intravenous injection. Cyanide acts fastest that way. Almost instantaneous collapse. Holmes rose and moved to the window. The sash was fastened, but a faint smear of red clay marred the sill, same reddish tint he had seen on Lord Charles's boots the night before. Yet this was older, overlaid with dust. Someone stood here, perhaps watching the corridor through the gap in the curtains. The clay is East End dock mud, mixed with coal dust from the gasworks, not native to Pall Mall. Gregson grunted. Half of London's messengers carry that mud, but not half carry it into a gentleman's club library, Holmes observed, and not with the precision to leave it only on this sill and nowhere else in the room. He turned to the bookshelf again. Behind the 3 displaced volumes lay a small brass case, no larger than a matchbox. Inside, a single unused glass syringe, its needle still capped in cork. Holmes lifted it with gloved fingers. The murderer prepared 2, one used, one spare. He took the used one away, but overlooked this. Watson felt a chill deeper than the fog outside. Then he was interrupted, or careless, or arrogant, Holmes said softly. He believed the locked room illusion perfect. The syringe was insurance against failure. They stood in silence for a moment. Rain began tapping the window panes, a steady, soft rhythm that blended with the distant foghorns moaning on the river. The temperature in the room had dropped as the fire burned low. Watson tasted the faint metallic edge of fear on his tongue, the same taste he remembered from Afghan battlefields. Holmes spoke again, voice measured. "Consider the methodology, Watson. This is no crime of passion, no clumsy poisoning of a decanter, no blunt instrument. The killer chose a locked room, a rare poison, a needle through a keyhole. Every element calculated to baffle, yet every element leaves its trace, the scratch, the blood drop, the clay, the spare syringe. The perfect crime is a myth. There is only the nearly perfect crime, and the man who leaves just enough for the trained eye." He paced slowly, boots soft on the turkey carpet. "I recall the case of the Aberystwyth forger in '87. He too used a locked study. A poisoned pen nib slipped into a letter. The victim died clutching the page, ink still wet. Scotland Yard called it suicide until I demonstrated the nib had been hollowed and filled with strychnine, traceable by the slight irregularity in the handwriting's pressure. The murderer had overlooked the magnifying lens and the faint tremor in his own hand when he wrote the address. Here, similarly, the killer trusted too much in the fog and the club's reputation for discretion." Gregson shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying this was planned weeks in advance? Months, perhaps?" Holmes answered. "The debt to Harrington was no sudden thing. The political quarrel with Fitzroy had simmered for years. Vale's ambition was plain to anyone who watched him. Montague's coolness masked desperation. One of them, or an agent, studied this room, measured the keyhole, rehearsed the angle. The crime is not in the act, but in the preparation." Watson looked at his friend, admiration mingling with unease. "Then the locked door was never a mystery. It was the signature." Holmes nodded once. "Precisely. And signatures, like handwriting, betray their author." The rain strengthened, drumming harder against the glass. Outside, hansom cabs splashed through puddles, wheels hissing. Inside, the coal fire gave a final sharp crackle and settled. Holmes closed the brass case with a soft click. "Crime seeks perfection through concealment," he said quietly. "Detection seeks truth through revelation. The one is fragile, the other inevitable." Gregson cleared his throat. "If you're right, Holmes, we've a devilish clever murder on our hands." Holmes turned, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Not clever enough." Chapter 4. Shadows in the fog. The fog rolled thicker as evening fell, turning London into a city of muffled sounds and blurred silhouettes. Sherlock Holmes stood at the window of 221B Baker Street, watching the gas lamps flicker like dying stars. The sharp smell of shag tobacco filled the room, mingling with the warm leather of his armchair and the faint damp wool of Watson's coat drying by the fire. "We move tonight," Holmes declared abruptly, turning with the swift energy that always followed a period of stillness. "Montague dines at the club until 9. Fitzroy plays billiards until 10. Vale remains in his office until late. We shall test each in turn." Watson set down his medical journal. "Test them how?" "By observation under pressure," Holmes replied, "and by placing temptation in their path." Their first call was to Sir Evelyn Montague's townhouse in Belgrave Square. The butler admitted them with cool formality, the hallway heavy with the scent of beeswax polish and coal smoke from the grate. Montague received them in the drawing room, a fresh Havana between his fingers. The rich leaf-culling blue smoked toward the ceiling. "Emma." "Holmes," he said smoothly. "You are persistent. What brings you to my door at this hour?" Holmes produced the small brass syringe case found behind the books. "This was discovered in the library. It matches the instrument that delivered the cyanide. The needle is of Swiss manufacture, uncommon in England. You have traveled recently to Geneva, have you not?" Montague's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained even. "Many gentlemen visit Switzerland." "What of it?" "The needle bears a minute engraving, your initials, E.M., on the plunger cap. A gentleman's affectation, perhaps." Montague exhaled slowly. "If that is true, someone has planted it. I have never owned such a thing." Holmes inclined his head. "We shall see." He turned on his heel and left without another word, leaving Montague staring after them, the cigar trembling slightly in his hand. Outside, the cold night air beat at their faces. Hansom wheels hissed past on wet cobbles. A distant foghorn groaned from the river. Watson felt the rough wool of his scarf against his chin. "You bluffed him, Holmes." "I presented a fact and watched the reaction," Holmes corrected. "The initials are not there." Yet his hand shook. Guilt or fear? Next they saw Colonel Fitzroy at the Army and Navy Club. The colonel was in the billiard room, cue in hand, the click of ivory balls sharp against the low murmur of conversation. The air smelled of cigar smoke, brandy, and the faint gunpowder residue that always clung to bold soldiers' uniforms. Fitzroy saw them approach and straightened. "Holmes!" "Still playing detective?" Holmes gestured to the ebony walking stick propped against the table. "May I examine your stick, Colonel?" Fitzroy bristled. "Why?" "Because it is precisely the length required to reach through the keyhole from the corridor, and the silver tip shows fresh scratches, metal on brass." The colonel's face reddened. "Preposterous. I carry this stick from habit. India taught me never to be without a weapon." Holmes lifted the stick anyway, running his fingers along its length. The cap unscrews, hollow inside. Room enough for a syringe, perhaps. Fitzroy snatched it back. "You overstep, sir. I shall complain to the commissioner." Holmes smiled thinly. "Do so. But know that I have already requested the mortuary photographs. The puncture angle matches a stick held at chest height. Your height precisely." They left the colonel fuming, Q trembling in his grip. Outside, rain began again, soft and steady, drumming on their hats. The chill seeped through Watson's gloves. He tasted the metallic bite of fog on his lips. Their final visit was to young Reginald Vale's modest lodgings near the Strand. The secretary answered the door himself, pale and disheveled, the smell of strong coffee and ink heavy in the tiny sitting room. "Emma." "Holmes," Vale said, voice unsteady. I expected you sooner." Holmes stepped inside without invitation. "You wrote Lord Harrington's final note, did you not?" Vale flinched. "He dictated it to me 2 days before the end. Said it was for his solicitor. I swear I knew nothing of poison." Holmes produced a fragment of paper from his pocket, torn from the club waste bin. "This matches your handwriting. Yet the final note in the library shows a tremor absent here, written under duress." Vale sank into a chair, the coarse fabric of his trousers rasping. "He forced me. Said if I did not help him stage the suicide, he would expose my indiscretion. A matter of cards and borrowed money." Holmes leaned closer. "And the syringe?" "I know nothing of any syringe." A sudden noise from the corridor, footsteps retreating rapidly. Holmes darted to the door, flinging it open. A shadowy figure vanished down the stairwell into the fog. Holmes pursued, boots pounding the wooden steps, but the intruder melted into the night. Back inside, Vale trembled. "That was him, my creditor. He's been watching me." Holmes's voice came low and certain. "I think he already has his next target in sight, and we shall be waiting." The cab rattled forward into the murk, wheels splashing through puddles. Somewhere ahead, in the labyrinth of fog-bound streets, A killer walked free, for now. Chapter 5. Pursued through the Blackfriars mist, the fog lay heaviest along the Victoria embankment, swallowing gas lamps and turning the Thames into a wide, invisible river that sighed against stone. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson left the cab at Blackfriars Bridge, the irregular boys' tips still fresh in their ears. The night air carried the dank smell of river mud, mingled with coal smoke from the trains rumbling overhead, and the faint, sour tang of horse manure on the wet cobbles. Holmes moved swiftly, coat flapping, eyes scanning every shadow. The man who fled Vale's lodgings came this way. He carries a walking stick, likely Fitzroy's, or one very like it. We must intercept him before he reaches the warehouses. Watson kept pace, the cold biting through his gloves, the rough wool of his scarf chafing his neck. If he is the murderer, he knows we are close. He may turn dangerous. That, Holmes said, is precisely why we hurry. They followed the river path, footsteps muffled by the fog. A foghorn moaned low and long from a barge somewhere downstream. Big Ben struck 10:30, the deep notes vibrating through the damp air. Ahead, a tall figure in a dark overcoat paused beneath a lamp, silver-mounted stick tapping the ground. The man glanced back once, face obscured, then lengthened his stride toward the narrow alleys behind the wharves. Holmes broke into a run, Watson close behind. The chase led through a warren of brick walls and stacked crates, the ground slick with river seepage. The smell of tar and rotting timber grew stronger. Ropes hung damp and coarse from iron rings. Holmes vaulted a low barrier, landing lightly. Watson followed more heavily, breath coming in sharp bursts. The figure ahead darted left into a yard piled with barrels. Holmes signaled Watson to circle right. They converged at the far end, just as the man reached a locked gate. He spun, stick raised like a cudgel. "Stand," Holmes commanded, voice cutting through the mist. The man hesitated, then lunged. The stick whistled past Holmes' ear. Holmes caught the wrist with practiced ease, twisting until the weapon clattered to the stones. Watson arrived in time to seize the man's other arm. The captive struggled briefly, then sagged. Up close, the face belonged not to Fitzroy nor Montague, but to a stranger, hard-featured, scarred across one cheek, eyes wild with calculation. His coat reeked of cheap tobacco and the river. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, pinning him against the wall. The brick felt cold and gritty through his gloves. "Name's Grimes," the man rasped. "I does odd jobs. Nothing more." Holmes pressed harder. "Odd jobs that include fleeing secretaries' lodgings and carrying a hollow walking stick? Speak plainly, or Scotland Yard will have you by dawn." Grimes licked dry lips. "I was paid to watch Vale. Make sure he kept quiet. That's all." "Paid by whom?" Grimes glanced at the stick on the ground. "Gentleman, tall, foreign accent, slight. Gave me a sovereign and said to scare the lad if he talked too much." Watson retrieved the stick. It unscrewed at the cap, revealing a narrow compartment, empty now, but long enough for a syringe. "This is the weapon," Watson said quietly, "or one like it." Holmes released Grimes but kept hold of his collar. "Describe your employer precisely." "Grey coat, silver-headed cane. Not this one. Smoked them fancy cigars. Saw him once at the club door, talking to Sir Evelyn." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Montague." Grimes nodded jerkily. "Aye, but I never done no killing. I only watched and waited." A sudden sound, boots on wet stone, came from the alley behind them. Holmes spun. Another figure emerged from the fog. Sir Evelyn Montague himself, breathing hard, a small revolver glinting in his hand. "Release him, Holmes," Montague said, voice steady despite the tremor in his grip. "This need not end in violence." Watson stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between Holmes and the barrel. "Sir Evelyn, put the weapon down." Montague ignored him. "You have no proof. Only a servant's word and an empty stick." Holmes spoke calmly, fingers still on Grimes's collar. I have the spare syringe from the library. I have the scratch on the keyhole cover. I have the red clay on the sill, dark mud that matches the soles of your shoes even now. And I have the note you forced Vale to copy, your handwriting disguised, but the pressure marks identical to your personal correspondence. Montague's face paled. Lies! No lies, Holmes continued. Only observation. You owed Harrington £30,000 from cards, debts you could never repay without ruin. He threatened exposure unless you settled by Christmas. You studied the library for weeks. You oiled the keyhole, measured the distance, prepared the cyanide from the club's vermin powder. Grimes here was your lookout, paid to ensure Vale remained silent after forging the suicide note. The foghorn sounded again, closer now. Rain began to fall in earnest, tapping on barrels and soaking their coats. Montague raised the revolver higher. Step back, both of you. Holmes did not move. You will not shoot. Not here. Not with witnesses. The game ends tonight, Sir Evelyn. For a long moment the two men regarded each other, hunter and hunted. Then Montague's shoulders sagged. The revolver lowered. Grimes broke free and bolted into the fog. Holmes made no move to pursue. He is of no consequence now. Montague let the pistol fall to the mud. I did not intend murder, he murmured, only to frighten him into silence. The needle was meant to wound, enough to make him confess his own ruin. But the dose was too strong. Watson knelt, retrieving the revolver. You will come with us quietly. Montague nodded once, defeated. The rain drummed harder, washing the last traces of cigar smoke from the air. Holmes looked toward the river, where the first streaks of dawn grey were beginning to pierce the fog. The game, he said softly, is afoot no longer. They walked back toward Blackfriars Bridge in silence, Montague between them, wrists bound with Holmes's handkerchief. The city was waking, distant cart wheels, a milkman's call, the slow chime of a church bell. The chase had ended not in violence, but in revelation, and yet Holmes knew the final thread had not yet been pulled. Chapter 6. Motive in the smoke. The police station at Scotland Yard smelled of carbolic soap, damp wool uniforms, and the faint metallic tang of ink from endless reports. Sherlock Holmes sat in the interview room beside Dr. Watson, watching Sir Evelyn Montague through the half-opened door of the adjoining cell. The baronet sat on a wooden bench, head bowed, the once immaculate grey coat now creased and mud-spattered from the Blackfriars chase. A single gas jet hissed overhead, casting long shadows across the flagstones. Inspector Gregson entered, wiping rain from his mustache. He's asked to speak with you, Holmes. Says he'll make a full statement, provided it's to you alone. Holmes rose without haste. Very well. Watson, remain here. Observe everything. Inside the cell, Montague looked up. His voice was low, almost conversational. You were right about the syringe. I had it made in Geneva 2 years ago, ostensibly for medical use after a riding accident. The truth is less noble. Holmes leaned against the wall, arms folded. The rough stone felt cold through his sleeve. Begin at the beginning. Montague exhaled slowly. Harrington and I played cards at the Reform for years. At first small stakes, gentlemen's amusement. Then the sums grew. I lost heavily, £32,000 over 18 months. He held my promissory notes. When I could not pay, he demanded I resign my seat in Parliament or face public exposure. Ruin either way. Watson, listening from the doorway, felt the chill of the room deepen. Outside, rain drummed steadily on the courtyard cobbles. A distant hansom cab rattled past, wheels hissing. Holmes prompted quietly, "And so you planned his death?" "Not at first." Montague's fingers traced the edge of the bench, wood worn smooth by countless prisoners. "I sought only leverage. I studied the library, weeks of afternoons pretending to read. I discovered the keyhole aperture behind the books. A test with a thin rod proved the distance workable. I dissolved vermin cyanide into a solution, filled the syringe. The plan was to wound him, enough to force a heart seizure, make it appear natural. I never intended murder, yet murder it became, Holmes observed. Montague nodded once. The dose was miscalculated. I struck too deeply, too swiftly. He collapsed before I could retrieve the needle. Panic took me. I left it embedded, then realized it would be found. I withdrew it through the keyhole, but in haste I grazed the collar. A drop of blood fell. I cleaned what I could, moved the chair to disguise the position, left the brandy glass as misdirection. The note Vale had copied earlier I placed beside him. Holmes steepled his fingers. And Grimes? A hired shadow. I needed someone to watch Vale after the forgery. The boy was ambitious, easily bought with promises, but when you began pressing, I feared he would break. I went to silence him myself. Too late. The cell grew quieter. Coal smoke drifted in from the corridor grate, warm against the night chill seeping under the door. Watson tasted bitter coffee from earlier on his tongue, now soured by the weight of confession. Holmes spoke again. The walking stick you carried tonight, was it the delivery device? No, that was a spare I kept in my study. The one Grimes carried belonged to Fitzroy. I borrowed it weeks ago under pretense of admiring the silver work. He never knew it left his possession. A long pause. Montague looked up, eyes hollow. I am not a monster, Mr. Holmes. Only a desperate man who misjudged the consequences. Holmes regarded him steadily. Desperation excuses nothing when it ends in death. Yet the criminal mind fascinates me still. You constructed a nearly perfect illusion. Locked room, suicide note, poison in the glass. Every element designed to deflect scrutiny. And yet every element betrayed you. The clay from your own shoes tracked in haste. The spare syringe forgotten in arrogance. The tremor in Vale's forged note that matched your own hand under stress. Montague smiled faintly, bitterly. You see everything. I observe what others overlook, Holmes replied. Consider the pattern. The locked room murder is as old as crime itself. Yet each perpetrator believes his variation unique. I recall the case of the Brixton banker in '89. Poisoned in his study, door bolted, window nailed shut. The murderer used a trained cat to carry the capsule through a small ventilation hole, then recalled the animal with a whistle. Scotland Yard called it suicide until I found cat hairs on the sill and a whistle in the killer's pocket. Here, similarly, the keyhole was your ventilation hole, the syringe your capsule. Technique differs. Vanity remains constant. He paced the narrow cell, boots soft on the stone. Crime is never random. It follows laws as rigid as physics. The murderer selects his method according to opportunity, temperament, and hubris. You chose subtlety because you are a gentleman. Violence would have offended your sense of decorum. Yet that very refinement left traces a coarser criminal might have avoided. Montague listened without interruption. The rain eased outside. A foghorn sounded once, mournful and distant. Holmes stopped. One final question. Why the Reform Club? Why not some private meeting, a quiet poisoning elsewhere? Because the club was his sanctuary. Montague answered. To die there, in the heart of his world, seemed fitting retribution. And because I knew no servant would dare disturb a locked door. The sanctity of the gentleman's club was my greatest ally, and my undoing. Silence settled. Holmes turned toward the door. Your statement will be taken formally tomorrow. Justice, Sir Evelyn, proceeds without sentiment. Montague nodded slowly. I understand. As Holmes stepped into the corridor, Watson joined him. The warm glow of the station lamps felt almost welcoming after the cell's chill. Gregson waited, notebook ready. Holmes spoke quietly. He has confessed. The method, the motive, the execution, all laid bare. Watson looked back at the cell door, and yet I feel no triumph, only a sort of sadness. Holmes placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. That is the difference between us, Watson. I see the mechanism of the crime. You see the man behind it. They walked out into the damp night. The fog had begun to lift. Stars pricked through the thinning grey. A single hansom waited at the curb, horse stamping patiently. Holmes paused on the steps. "The case is not yet closed," he said. "There remains one thread, the precise moment of death. The mortuary report will confirm the time of injection. Until then, the shadow lingers." He climbed into the cab. Watson followed. The driver flicked his whip. Wheels turned on wet stone. Inside the carriage, Holmes leaned back, eyes distant. The criminal seeks to outwit reason. He never succeeds. Reason waits patiently, like the tide. The cab rattled toward Baker Street, carrying them home through the slowly clearing night. Chapter 7. The final thread. Morning light filtered weakly through the fog that still clung to Baker Street, turning the windows of 221B into pale grey squares. Sherlock Holmes stood at the chemical bench, sleeves rolled, examining the mortuary report under the bright flame of the spirit lamp. The paper smelled faintly of carbolic and printer's ink. Beside it lay the brass syringe case, the needle now cleaned and gleaming coldly. Dr. Watson entered with a telegram in hand, coat still damp from the short walk. "From Gregson. Montague has signed the full confession. He requests one last interview before formal charge." Holmes set down the lens without looking up. He will not recant. The man has passed the point of denial. But there remains one discrepancy, the precise time of death. Watson crossed to the fire, warming his hands against the chill that had settled in the room overnight. The coal crackled softly, sending small sparks up the chimney. The report states between 3:30 and 4. The waiter last saw him alive at 3:15. Yet the body was discovered at 4 precisely, Holmes observed, and the cyanide acted within seconds of injection. Therefore the puncture occurred no earlier than 3:50. Montague claims he struck at 3:45. Watson frowned. A small difference. Perhaps memory faltered under stress, or perhaps another hand intervened. Holmes paced rapidly, boots soft on the worn rug. "Consider the sequence again." Montague prepared the syringe, waited in the corridor. He inserted the needle through the keyhole, grazed once, struck true the second time. Harrington collapsed. Montague withdrew the instrument, left the note, departed. Yet the chair was shifted afterward. The brandy glass was placed deliberately. Someone returned after the injection. Watson sat heavily. An accomplice, or a witness who became an opportunist? Holmes stopped before the mantel, fingers steepled. "We have 4 principal figures. Montague the planner, Grimes the watcher, Vale the forger, Fitzroy the quarrelsome colonel. One of them, or someone overlooked, returned to perfect the illusion." A knock sounded at the outer door. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Gregson, followed by a uniformed constable carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Found this in Montague's study," Gregson said, "hidden behind a false panel in the bookcase. Thought you should see it before we charge him formally." Holmes unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a second syringe, identical to the first, but unused, and a folded sheet of notepaper. The handwriting matched Montague's exactly. Holmes read aloud. "If the first fails, use this. Strike at the base of the skull. Quicker, surer. No trace on the skin. Destroy after." The signature was absent, but the ink shade and nib pressure were identical to Montague's personal correspondence. Watson exhaled slowly. He prepared for failure. "No," Holmes corrected. "This is not his hand instructing himself. This is instruction to another." Gregson's brows rose. "You think he had a partner?" "I know he did." Holmes moved to the window, staring down into the street where a hansom waited. Montague is vain, precise, but not physically adept. The angle of the second puncture mark, confirmed by the mortuary photographs, was slightly higher and to the right. A man of Montague's height would have struck lower. Someone taller administered the fatal dose. Watson rose. "Fitzroy, Fitzroy is tall, military-bearing, familiar with anatomy from the field, and his walking stick vanished for several days, returned with fresh scratches. He lent it willingly, perhaps, or it was taken. Either way, he knew. Gregson snapped his notebook shut. Then we bring him in. Not yet, Holmes said. We confront him at the club, in public, where he cannot run. They arrived at the Reform Club just after luncheon. The smoking room was half full. Members murmured over newspapers, the air thick with Havana smoke and the warm scent of brandy. Colonel Fitzroy sat alone in a high-backed chair near the fire, stick across his knees, face flushed from port. Holmes approached without preamble. Colonel, a word. Fitzroy looked up, eyes narrowing. Holmes! Still hounding shadows. Holmes laid the second syringe on the small table between them. This was found in Montague's study, accompanied by a note in his hand, directing another to strike at the base of the skull. The mortuary confirms the second. Fatal wound was made precisely there. You are 6 inches taller than Montague. The angle matches. The room quieted. Several members turned, conversation dying. Fitzroy's hand tightened on the stick. Absurd. I was in the billiards room all afternoon. Until 3:40, Holmes said. The marker sheet shows you left at that hour. You returned to the library corridor, found Harrington already collapsing from Montague's first attempt. You finished the work, ensuring death, then arranged the chair and glass to complete the suicide illusion. You owed Montague a favor, perhaps, or shared his debt to Harrington. Fitzroy rose slowly, face darkening. You have no proof. I have the stick you lent him, returned with brass scratches matching the keyhole cover. I have the note, and I have you, standing now with the very instrument you used to administer the final blow. Holmes nodded toward the ebony stick. It unscrews, does it not? Hollow. Room for a second syringe. Fitzroy glanced at the door. Members had risen. The porter blocked the exit. Gregson stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Colonel Percival Fitzroy, Gregson declared, I arrest you on suspicion of murder. Fitzroy's shoulders slumped. The stick fell to the carpet with a dull thud. It was meant to be clean, he muttered. Montague botched it. I only corrected the mistake. Harrington would have ruined us both. Silence filled the room like fog. Watson felt the warmth of the fire against his back, the bitter taste of coffee still on his tongue from breakfast. Holmes stood motionless, eyes fixed on the broken man before him. Gregson motioned to the constable. Fitzroy allowed himself to be led away without resistance. As the door closed behind them, Holmes turned to Watson. Elementary, my dear fellow. The first injection weakened. The second killed. 2 hands, 1 crime. Watson nodded slowly. And now both are in custody. Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. The threads are drawn tight. The tapestry complete. Outside, the fog had begun to lift at last. Sunlight pierced the grey, faint but certain. Big Ben chimed the hour, clear, unhurried. The game, at long last, was over. Chapter 8. The scales of justice. The fog had lifted entirely by mid-morning, leaving London bathed in pale winter sunlight that seemed almost apologetic after weeks of gloom. At the Old Bailey, the corridors echoed with the shuffle of boots, the rustle of legal papers, and the low murmur of barristers conferring in corners. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson sat in the public gallery of Court Number 3, the air heavy with the scent of polished oak, old books, and the faint coal smoke that drifted in from the street whenever the doors opened. Sir Evelyn Montague and Colonel Percival Fitzroy stood in the dock side by side, yet separated by an invisible chasm of mutual accusation. Montague, pale and composed, kept his eyes on the judge's bench. Fitzroy, red-faced and rigid, stared straight ahead as though still on parade. Both wore dark suits that had once spoken of wealth and position. Now they seemed merely costumes for a grim play. The prosecutor, Sir Herbert Langley KC, presented the Crown's case with measured precision. He began with the physical evidence. The two syringes, one recovered from the library bookshelf, the other from Montague's study, both bearing traces of hydrocyanic acid. The brass keyhole cover, scratched minutely by the needle. The red clay from the windowsill, matched by chemical analysis to the dock mud near Blackfriars where Montague had been apprehended. The second, fatal puncture wound at the base of the skull, angled to indicate a taller assailant. Langley produced the mortuary photographs, enlarged and mounted on card. The jury leaned forward as he pointed to the tiny mark beneath Lord Harrington's collar, almost invisible to the naked eye, yet clear under magnification. "Gentlemen of the jury," he declared, "this was no suicide. This was murder by scientific method, cold, calculated, and executed with the tools of a gentleman's toilet case." Watson shifted beside Holmes, the smooth leather of the gallery bench creaking under him. The courtroom felt warm from the many bodies and the low fire in the grate. Yet Watson felt a chill at the base of his spine. Holmes watched impassively, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Langley called him to the witness box, he rose without haste and took the oath in a clear, even voice. "Emma, Holmes," Langley began, "you were consulted privately by the victim's brother. What first led you to suspect foul play?" "The Havana cigar ash in the tray," Holmes answered promptly. Lord Harrington smoked only Turkish cigarettes. The second set of fingerprints on the brandy glass, overlaid in condensation, the displaced chair legs, the scratch beside the keyhole, each detail inconsistent with suicide. "And your examination of the scene?" "I discovered the spare syringe behind the books, identical to the murder weapon. Later, a second syringe and a note in Sir Evelyn Montague's hand, instructing another party to strike at the base of the skull should the first attempt fail." A murmur ran through the court. Montague's barrister rose to object, but the judge allowed the evidence. Holmes continued. "The angle of the fatal wound required a man of Colonel Fitzroy's height. The walking stick he habitually carried, ebony, silver-mounted, unscrewed to reveal a hollow compartment precisely suited to conceal a syringe. It bore fresh brass scratches matching the keyhole cover." Fitzroy's jaw tightened visibly. Langley turned to the motive. "Sir Evelyn owed the deceased £32,000. Colonel Fitzroy owed Sir Evelyn a substantial sum in return for past favours, political introductions, gaming debts covered. Both stood to lose everything if Lord Harrington exposed their financial ruin." Holmes stepped down. The jury watched him return to his seat with something like awe. The defense attempted to sow doubt. Montague's counsel argued the syringes could have been planted. Fitzroy's barrister claimed the stick had been borrowed without his knowledge and the note forged. Yet the chain of physical evidence proved too strong. The clay on Montague's shoes, the tremor in Vale's forged suicide note matching Montague's disguised hand, the testimony of Grimes, who turned King's evidence in exchange for leniency, all converged. After 3 days, the jury retired. They returned in under 2 hours. "Guilty," the foreman declared, voice steady, "on the charge of murder, both defendants." Montague closed his eyes briefly. Fitzroy stared at the ceiling as though searching for escape in the plasterwork. The judge, wigged and scarlet-robed, pronounced sentence. "Sir Evelyn Montague, Colonel Percival Fitzroy, you are sentenced to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your souls." A low ripple passed through the public gallery. Watson felt the coarse wool of his coat sleeve as he gripped the rail. Holmes remained motionless. Outside the court, reporters surged forward. Holmes and Watson slipped away through a side door into the chill January air. The Thames glittered under weak sunlight. Gulls wheeled above the river, crying sharply. A hansom cab waited at the curb, hoarse snorting plumes of steam. Inside the cab, Watson broke the silence. "It is over, then." "Over in law," Holmes replied. "Yet justice is never swift, nor always satisfying. 2 men of position reduced to felons. A family name blackened forever, and Lord Harrington is still dead. Watson nodded slowly. You foresaw the outcome. I foresaw the mechanism. The rest is human frailty. They rode in silence toward Baker Street. The streets bustled with ordinary life, costermongers calling wares, clerks hurrying to offices, children dodging between cabs. The city had already begun to forget the scandal. Tomorrow's papers would carry fresher sensations. At 221B, Mrs. Hudson met them at the door with tea and a plate of buttered toast. The sitting room smelled of fresh coal, warm bread, and the faint, comforting shag tobacco Holmes had left smouldering in his pipe. Holmes sank into his armchair, legs stretched toward the fire. The loose ends are tied, he said. Montague's confession detailed every step. Fitzroy's corroborated the final act. Vale has been cleared. He was a dupe, nothing more. Lord Charles Harrington has withdrawn to the country to grieve in privacy. Watson poured tea, the hot liquid steaming against the cold china. And Grimes? Transported to Australia. A lighter sentence for his testimony. Watson settled opposite. You seem quiet. Holmes smiled faintly. I am satisfied, Watson, not triumphant. The case was intricate, the method ingenious. Yet it ended, as all such crimes do, in vulgar human motives. Debt, fear, betrayal. The fire crackled. Big Ben chimed the hour from distant Westminster. Outside, the afternoon light slanted golden across the rooftops. Holmes steepled his fingers. Justice begins now. The appeals will be heard, the sentences reviewed, but the truth has been spoken in open court. That is enough. Watson raised his cup. To reason, then. Holmes touched his own cup to it. To reason. The tea was hot and sweet on the tongue. The room felt warm, safe. The shadow of the case receded, leaving only the quiet routine of Baker Street and the promise of the next puzzle waiting somewhere in the fog-bound city. Chapter 9. Verdicts and quiet returns. The Old Bailey stood austere under a February sky of pale blue, the last remnants of winter fog clinging only to the river. Inside Court Number 3, the final day of proceedings arrived with the hush of inevitability. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson occupied the same seats in the public gallery they had taken weeks before, though the atmosphere now carried less tension and more the solemn weight of conclusion. The scent of waxed wood and old paper mingled with the faint coal smoke that drifted in every time the heavy doors opened to admit late arrivals. Sir Evelyn Montague and Colonel Percival Fitzroy stood once more in the dock. Their barristers had made their final pleas, Montague's counsel emphasizing diminished responsibility through financial desperation. Fitzroy's arguing he had acted only to correct an already fatal mistake. The jury, 12 ordinary men of London, had listened without visible emotion. The foreman rose when called. His voice carried clear across the oak-paneled room. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendants guilty. A single collective breath seemed to leave the courtroom. Montague bowed his head slightly. Fitzroy stared fixedly at the judge's bench, as though willing the words to reverse themselves. The judge, in scarlet and ermine, adjusted his spectacles and addressed them in measured tones. Sir Evelyn Montague, Colonel Percival Fitzroy, you have been found guilty of the wilful murder of Lord Archibald Harrington. The sentence of this court is that you be taken from hence to a place of lawful execution, and there suffer death by hanging. May the Lord have mercy upon your souls. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Uniformed warders stepped forward. Montague walked out steadily, eyes downcast. Fitzroy required a firmer grip on each arm before he moved. The gallery remained silent until the door closed behind them. Outside in the corridor, reporters surged toward Holmes and Watson as they descended the wide staircase. Questions flew like arrows. M.R. Holmes, do you feel justice has been served? Was the locked room mystery truly solved by science alone? Holmes raised a hand, voice calm. The evidence spoke for itself. The rest is for the law. They escaped into the chill air of Newgate Street. A weak sun shone on the cobbles. The smell of horse manure and fresh-baked bread from a nearby stall drifted on the breeze. Watson pulled his coat tighter against the wind off the Thames. "Two men of title condemned," he said quietly. "I never thought to see such a thing." Holmes walked beside him, hands clasped behind his back. Title offers no immunity from consequence, only the illusion of it. They took a hansom back to Baker Street. The ride was quiet, wheels rumbling over familiar streets. Big Ben chimed noon as they passed Westminster, the deep notes vibrating through the cab. Watson watched the city move around them, clerks hurrying to luncheon, ladies with parcels, children dodging between legs. Life continued, unmarked by the verdict delivered in the shadowed courtroom. At 221B, Mrs. Hudson greeted them with relief plain on her face. "Thank heavens it's done, Mr. Holmes. The papers have been full of nothing else. Shall I bring up tea?" "Tea and the afternoon post, if you please," Holmes replied. The sitting room felt warmer than the street outside. The fire burned steadily, coals settling with soft pops. Holmes sank into his armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth. Watson took the opposite seat, unlacing his boots with a sigh. The post brought several letters. One from Lord Charles Harrington, written from his country estate in Kent. Holmes read it aloud. "My dear Mr. Holmes, the verdict has brought a measure of peace, though the wound remains deep. My brother's name is cleared of the stain of self-destruction. The true perpetrators face their fate. I have withdrawn from public life for a time. The Reform Club has struck both names from membership and placed a memorial plaque in the library. Simple, dignified. Reginald Vale has resigned his post and taken a position in a solicitor's office in the city. He writes to me often, grateful for your intervention. Should you ever pass through Kent, my door is open." Holmes set the letter aside. An innocent man vindicated. That is no small thing. Another envelope bore the stamp of Scotland Yard. Gregson's bold hand filled the page. Holmes Montague's appeal was lodged this morning, as expected. Fitzroy's followed suit. Neither will succeed. The evidence is ironclad. The Home Secretary has already declined clemency. Execution set for the 18th of March. Your assistance made the difference. Scotland Yard owes you one. Watson smiled faintly. High praise from Gregson. Grudging praise, Holmes corrected, but sincere. The third letter came from Reginald Vale himself, short, earnest. "Sir, I write to thank you. You saw through the forgery, the fear, the lies. Without your intervention, I might have been ruined or worse. I have begun again. The past is behind me." Holmes folded it neatly. The young man will do well. Ambition tempered by experience is a powerful combination. Watson poured tea from the tray Mrs. Hudson had left. The hot liquid steamed against the cold china. He tasted the faint bitterness of the leaves, sweetened by milk. "And the club itself, reformed in more ways than one," Holmes replied. "The committee has instituted new rules. No private keys to the library after hours. No unattended service in locked rooms. A small price for restoring trust." They sat in companionable silence. Outside, a hansom cab clattered past. Children laughed in the street below. The afternoon light slanted across the rug, warming the faded colors. Holmes reached for his pipe, tamping tobacco with precise movements. The strong scent of shag rose as he lit it, culling blue toward the ceiling. Watson broke the quiet. "You seem at ease." "I am satisfied," Holmes said. "The puzzle is complete, every piece placed. The locked room was no impossibility, only a clever contrivance undone by observation. The murderer's vanity left traces. Pride always does." He exhaled a long plume of smoke. "Crime seeks concealment. Detection seeks revelation. Today, revelation prevailed." Watson nodded slowly. "And tomorrow? Tomorrow another case will knock, urgent, desperate. Until then, we rest." The fire crackled. Big Ben chimed the quarter hour, distant but clear. The city moved on outside the window, handsome wheels on cobbles, vendors calling, life in its endless rhythm. Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. Order is restored, Watson. For a time, Watson smiled. A rare and welcome thing. The tea cooled in their cups. The room held warmth, quiet, and the faint, comforting smell of tobacco and coal. In the aftermath of justice, Baker Street returned to its familiar peace. Chapter 10. Reason's Quiet Triumph. A soft March rain pattered against the windows of 221B Baker Street. Gentle after the long winter, the sitting room glowed with the warm light of the fire. Coal settled in the grate with small contented sighs. Sherlock Holmes lounged in his armchair, dressing gown open at the throat, pipe sending thin blue threads of shag tobacco curling toward the ceiling. Dr. Watson sat opposite, legs stretched toward the hearth, the latest edition of the Times folded on his knee. The scent of strong tobacco mingled with the sweet steam rising from their brandy glasses and the faint leather polish of Watson's boots drying by the fender. The newspapers had finally moved on. The execution of Sir Evelyn Montague and Colonel Percival Fitzroy had taken place at Pentonville Prison 2 days earlier, swift, private, unceremonious. The Reform Club had quietly removed the memorial plaque from the library wall. Whispers of the affair had faded into the polite silence that high society reserves for unpleasant truths. Lord Charles Harrington had returned to London briefly to settle affairs, then retired permanently to Kent. Reginald Vale had secured a junior partnership in a quiet firm near Lincoln's Inn Fields. His letters spoke of gratitude and steady progress. Holmes exhaled a long plume of smoke. The aftermath is always anticlimactic, Watson. The criminal mind, once exposed, loses its mystery. What remains is mere paperwork, appeals denied, sentences carried out, families left to bear the name in silence. Watson sipped his brandy, the sweet burn steadying him against the chill that lingered in the room. Montague's last letter to the Home Secretary was published today. He expressed remorse, not for the act, but for the stain on his class. Fitzroy's family has emigrated to Canada. The scandal dies with them. Holmes nodded slowly. And yet the mechanism endures. Two men of education and position, driven by debt and fear, constructed a crime of extraordinary ingenuity. The locked room, the keyhole syringe, the staged suicide note, every element a deliberate affront to reason. They believed themselves cleverer than the world that judged them. He set the pipe aside and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, eyes distant. That is the eternal delusion of the criminal intellect. They imagine they can outwit observation by adding layers of complication. Yet complication itself becomes the clue. The scratch on the brass keyhole cover was minute, yet it spoke of metal on metal. The red clay on the sill was faint, yet it traced a path from the docks to Pall Mall. The tremor in the forged note betrayed the hand that wrote it under duress. Each attempt at concealment became a revelation. Watson leaned forward. You always say the impossible is merely the unexplained. Precisely. Holmes rose and began to pace slowly, boots soft on the worn Persian rug. When you have eliminated the impossible, suicide in a locked room without external agency, what remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Here the improbable was a needle passed through a keyhole, guided by calculation and hubris. Montague planned the first strike. Fitzroy, in panic or complicity, delivered the second. Their partnership was never one of equals, only of shared ruin. He paused before the window, gazing down into the rain-slicked street where a single hansom cab splashed past. I have seen this pattern before. Recall the case of the speckled band in 83 DR. Grimesby Roylott attempted murder through a ventilator shaft with a trained snake. He believed the locked bedroom and the apparent natural death would defeat inquiry. Yet the bell pull that was no bell pull, the saucer of milk, the whistle in the night, all betrayed him. Similarly, the Reform Club murderer trusted in the sanctity of the gentleman's club, The fog, the locked door, yet the cigar ash, the displaced chair, the unused syringe, all spoke louder than silence. Holmes turned back to the fire. Observation is not guesswork, Watson. It is the patient accumulation of fact until the pattern emerges. The untrained eye sees a locked room and accepts impossibility. The trained eye sees a keyhole, a scratch, a trace of clay, and follows where they lead. Guesswork invents. Deduction discovers. In this case, every physical trace, from the angle of the puncture to the tremor in the ink, formed a chain no conjecture could break. He resumed his seat, voice quieter now. Crime is an assertion of will against order. The criminal seeks to impose his reality upon the world. Here, the reality that Lord Harrington took his own life. But the world resists. Material evidence persists. A drop of blood, a speck of ash, a misplaced chair. These are not opinions. They are facts, and facts properly interrogated yield truth. Watson set his glass down. You make it sound inevitable. It is inevitable, Holmes replied, not because justice is perfect, but because reason is relentless. The criminal may delay discovery through ingenuity, through fear, through luck, but he cannot erase the traces he leaves. Pride demands he leave them. Fear demands he overlook them. Between the two, detection finds its path. The rain eased outside. A shaft of late sunlight pierced the clouds, gilding the wet rooftops opposite. Holmes picked up his violin from the table, drew the bow across the strings in a slow, contemplative phrase. The notes hung in the warm air, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the distant chime of Big Ben marking the hour. Watson watched his friend with quiet affection. You never tire of it, do you? The chase, the revelation. Holmes lowered the instrument. I tire of boredom. The mind requires occupation. When the puzzle is solved, the mind rests until the next knock at the door. He smiled faintly. And there will always be another. Human nature does not change. Vanity, greed, fear, these are constants. Only the methods vary. Watson rose and crossed to the window, looking down at the street now glistening under clearing skies. A boy whistled as he delivered newspapers. A woman hurried past beneath an umbrella that dripped silver in the sunlight. Perhaps, Watson said, but so does loyalty, courage, reason. Those endure too. Holmes joined him at the window. Indeed, and in the balance, reason prevails. Not through force, but through patience. Not through passion, but through precision. They stood in silence for a time, watching the city breathe again. The fog had lifted completely. The Thames glittered far below, a ribbon of silver under the spring sky. Holmes spoke once more, voice low and certain. In the end, Watson, the supremacy of reason is not a boast. It is a quiet fact. The criminal schemes in shadow. The detective waits in light, and when the shadow retreats, only truth remains. Watson nodded. A comforting thought. Holmes returned to his chair, pipe relit, smoke rising once more. Comforting and true. The fire burned low. The rain had stopped. Baker Street lay peaceful in the gathering dusk, the world outside turning on without drama or mystery for the moment. And in that quiet room, two friends sat, content in the knowledge that reason, patient and unyielding, had once again carried the day.